Hey, before we start, let me just warn you. This story isn't your typical old-timey tale of cozy cabins and brave pioneers. Because what really happened out on the western frontier during the winter of 1886 wasn't just cold, it was downright terrifying. We're talking about a season so merciless, it didn't just freeze cattle standing upright, it drove entire families to secrets they'd carry to their graves. Some burned everything they owned just to stay alive. Some vanished into the snow and were found weeks later in, well, let's just say in states that left their neighbors whispering for years. There were scandals too. Dark, shameful things folks tried hard to cover up once the thaw came. People who swore they'd never resort to violence found themselves standing over bloodied fence lines with rifles still warm in their hands. And the strangest part? The decisions made during those brutal months didn't just save or doom individual families. They completely transformed how the West worked, who survived, and who never stood a chance. So, if you think you're ready for the unsettling, the scandalous, and even the downright grisly truths buried under all that snow, get cozy, take a slow breath, and stick with me to the end. Because that's where the most disturbing revelations of this story wait, the kind that might just change how you picture those so-called good old days forever. Imagine opening your eyes to a gray half-light that seems to cling to every surface, pressing down on your chest before you even take your first breath. The wooden walls around you are close, closer than you remember from last night, as if the cold itself had crept in and swollen the logs to squeeze the space tighter. When you do breathe in, the air is sharp, biting at your lungs with a crispness so intense it feels almost alive. A thin sting spreads through your nostrils, a reminder that here, in this remote stretch of the western frontier, even the act of drawing breath comes with its own little trial. You stay still for a moment, cocooned beneath layers of heavy blankets that smell faintly of smoke and wool. Moving too quickly would break the fragile pocket of warmth your body has created overnight. The straw mattress beneath you crackles softly each time you shift, rustling like brittle leaves, but at least it separates you from the bone-hard boards of the cabin floor.
Somewhere under all these covers, your hands are curled up near your chest, trying to keep what little heat they've gathered through the night. You flex your fingers once, then again, feeling the ache of stiffness that borders on something more troubling, that slow creep of numbness you've come to fear. Outside, the world is hushed in a way that only deep winter can accomplish. There are no birds greeting the dawn, no distant neigh of a horse, not even the low sigh of wind through bare branches. Just silence, thick and complete, broken only by the faint pop of the logs inside your stove, which must be struggling to stay alive after hours of slow burning through the night. You take a cautious breath and push one hand out from under the blankets. Instantly, the cold snatches at your skin, turning the simple motion into a shock. It feels as though the air might shatter against your fingertips, leaving tiny slivers of ice embedded in your flesh. This is not a cold that merely inconveniences. This is a cold that threatens, that tests the edges of your endurance from the moment you wake. Still, you know you can't lie there forever. The routine has been drilled into you by countless mornings just like this. Wait too long and the lingering warmth will fade entirely, making the eventual emergence even more brutal. So, you throw back the blankets in one quick motion, hissing through your teeth as the air envelops your body like a living, frigid thing. You swing your legs over the side of the bed and plant your feet on the plank floor. Even through thick wool socks, the cold shoots up your legs, shocking you fully awake. Last night's clothing has been waiting at the foot of the bed, stuffed under the blankets to keep it from turning into stiff, icy husks by morning. You pull on your trousers and shirt with practiced urgency, savoring the small mercy of fabric that isn't frozen through. Then come the extra layers: a wool vest, a heavier overshirt, thick trousers reinforced at the knees, and finally a coat that still carries the faint scent of the animal it once belonged to. Each layer seals a bit more of your precious body heat in, but you can't help noticing that even bundled this way, there's no real sense of comfort, only a temporary holding action against the cold. Your breath billows out in front of you in pale, ghostly clouds. When you cross to the tiny window, a sheet of oiled paper stretched tight over a rough wooden frame, you see the faintest lace of frost spiderwebbed across it. The patterns are almost beautiful, delicate traceries of ice that remind you nature's artistry doesn't stop just because it's trying to kill you. The cabin is dim, lit only by a feeble shaft of gray that slips in through the frosted pane. You can just make out the iron stove squatting in the corner, its surface mottled with soot, small curls of smoke still twisting up from the seams. It's an old friend, that stove, temperamental, prone to belching smoke at inopportune moments, but ultimately the thin line between survival and a night that ends badly. Even so, this morning it's little more than lukewarm, the coals inside stubbornly clinging to life. You cross to it quickly, your breath quickening, both from the cold and a ripple of anxiety. If the coals have gone out completely, you'll be facing a far more desperate scramble. Kneeling, you open the small door and are relieved to find a dull red glow nestled under a pile of ash. Not much, but enough. You add carefully split kindling, thin pieces of wood you stacked weeks ago in anticipation of mornings just like this. Then, with hands already stiff and awkward, you strike a match. The flame flares brightly, tiny and defiant, and for a heartbeat it seems impossibly fragile. You shield it with your hands, guiding it to the waiting kindling. It catches with a soft whoosh, licking up along the edges of the wood, and you exhale in gratitude. Moments later, the little fire grows bolder, crackling softly, sending up wisps of fragrant smoke that thread through the cabin. There's no time to luxuriate. You add more wood, slightly larger pieces now, and close the door to let the stove begin its slow work. Already, the metal skin is warming, heat radiating just enough that when you press your palms against it, your skin sings with relief. You stand there for longer than necessary, soaking in the fragile warmth, knowing that in this wilderness, each dawn begins with this small, crucial victory. Your stomach growls, another reminder that this day, like all the days before, will demand your energy from the first hour. In the back of your mind, you begin listing the chores waiting beyond these four thin walls, checking the water troughs for ice, breaking them open again if the cold has sealed them solid, bringing in more wood from the stack outside before the next snowfall buries it deeper, looking in on the animals whose survival is intertwined with your own. For now, though, you allow yourself these last moments by the stove. You roll your shoulders, feeling the heavy layers shift against each other. Every muscle seems to ache from yesterday's labor, from endless bending and hauling and chopping, from sleeping curled against the cold. It's a familiar ache, a reassurance that despite everything, your body is still meeting the challenge.
Somewhere in this cabin hangs the faint scent of last night's meal, a stew of beans and a scrap of salt pork that clung to the sides of the pot as though unwilling to be consumed. That meager dinner, like every meal here, was as much fuel as it was food, stoking the internal fires that keep your core temperature just high enough to push back against the biting air. Another breath, deeper this time. Your lungs still protest the cold, but you can feel them warming with each cycle. This is how it begins every day, a battle for the first breath, the first step onto icy floorboards, the coaxing of stubborn flames back to life. 100 tiny triumphs stitched together to make survival possible. You glance toward the door, where the heavy wooden latch waits, barring a world that promises even harsher challenges the moment you cross the threshold. Soon enough, you'll open it. Soon enough, you'll step out into a landscape that glitters deceptively under frost and snow, each breath turning instantly to vapor. But for now, you savor the last few seconds by the stove. It's a fragile haven, this dim cabin with its patched walls and thin roof, but it's yours. And in this frozen frontier, even the simplest shelter is a precious stronghold against a world that seems determined to test just how much cold a person can endure. And so begins another day, in a land where warmth is never guaranteed, where every sunrise means another gamble with forces far older and more indifferent than yourself. Yet for all its biting cruelty, there's a strange, hard beauty here too, a reminder that even in the starkest cold, life still manages to cling on, stubborn as any pioneer, determined to see another dawn. Your hands move almost automatically now, driven by the countless mornings spent in the same anxious ritual. You check the little box tucked on a shelf close by, a battered tin container with a sliding lid that rattles softly when you shake it. Inside are your matches, precious slivers of wood tipped with the promise of flame. You count them by touch as much as by sight, feeling each slender body roll under your fingertips, whispering a silent plea that you'll have enough to last through however many bitter mornings remain. Out here, a single match isn't just a tool, it's a lifeline. You've learned to protect them like fragile treasures. They spend the night close to your body, tucked into a pocket or wrapped in a scrap of cloth and slipped under your blankets. Even a tiny bit of moisture could ruin them, rendering their heads soft and useless when you strike. Many settlers lost homes, and sometimes far more, because dampness turned their fire-starting efforts into desperate failures. You've heard the stories. Neighbors who woke to dead coals, found their matches spoiled, and faced a morning where even shivering became dangerous.
So you've become meticulous. Matches never sit unattended on a shelf to grow cold and draw dew. They stay warm and dry, their survival as carefully managed as your own. When you pull one out now, you handle it like glass, cradling it in your palm for a moment to reassure yourself of its dryness before drawing it across the rough side of the box. The tiny spark leaps to life with a sharp hiss, the smell of sulfur blooming bright and acrid. For a breathless second, you shield it from even the smallest draft, leaning in close, your breath held back so as not to snuff it out. The kindling waits, arranged in careful layers inside the stove. In the evenings, you always prepare it before banking the fire down, setting up tomorrow's hope before you even sleep. Thin curls of bark, dry grasses twisted into loose bundles, splinters shaved off larger logs, anything that will catch quickly and climb toward flame. Once the match finds them, the first crackle is almost a relief, the sound of life coming back to your cabin. Flames dance over the wood, hungrily licking along edges, orange tongues that seem to stretch out toward your hands. In another minute, small twigs join the chorus, snapping as the heat deepens. There's a rhythm to this, a careful feeding of the new fire. Too much wood too soon, and you'll smother it, rob it of air, and watch it gutter into choking smoke. Too little, and the tiny flames might die before they can gain the strength to consume anything larger. So you nurse it along, adding pieces no thicker than your thumb, watching as they darken, split, and then blossom into glowing red. In many places back east, firewood was a given.
forests thick with oak and maple, entire hillsides waiting to be felled and stacked. Here on the plains, trees are a rare luxury, often found only along creeks or scattered miles apart. Most cabins like yours might have logs hauled from far distances just to build walls. Cutting enough wood to last an entire winter, especially one like this, could break even the strongest homesteader. That's why you learn to look elsewhere for fuel. Beyond your window, snow blankets everything, but underneath that white lies the true treasure: dried buffalo chips, the compact remains of massive herds that once thundered across these lands. What would seem foul to someone untested by frontier life is to you a minor miracle. Dried dung burns hot and clean, leaving little ash, no worse a smell than damp earth, and best of all, it's scattered everywhere for the gathering. When the buffalo grew scarce, you and your neighbors turned to cow chips. Not quite as dense, perhaps, but still a godsend when the nearest stand of timber might be a day's journey away. It changes how you prepare each day's heat. Instead of splitting cords with an axe, your chores involve wandering the pastures, burlap sacks slung over your shoulder, bending to collect every brittle, sun-cured disc you find. It's humbling work, your breath misting before your face, fingers numbing inside wool gloves as you pick through the snow. But you stack these humble fuels beside your stove just as proudly as any family might display a pile of seasoned oak. They represent not just warmth, but cleverness, adaptation, the triumph of necessity over vanity. Now, with the stove waking fully, the iron sides growing too hot to touch, you feed in a few buffalo chips. The smell shifts, deepens. Not unpleasant, simply earthy. The scent of long grass transformed by animal and sun and time. You stand close, palms out, letting the heat seep into your stiff fingers. Each tiny capillary in your skin seems to sigh, opening gratefully, pulling in life. This fire is more than comfort. It's medicine against the creeping ache that comes from long hours in frigid air, a bulwark against frostbite that has claimed more than a few unlucky travelers and careless settlers. It's a small, roaring reminder that here, in this place of icy teeth and breath that smokes like fog, humans still have the cunning to summon summer right in the belly of winter. Soon, you'll hang a kettle above the flames, water drawn from a nearby creek days ago and stored in barrels to keep it from freezing solid. It will hiss and rattle on the stove's top, steam coiling into the room. Maybe you'll brew a bit of coffee if you're lucky enough to have some left, or pine needle tea if not, sharp and green and strangely invigorating. All of it made possible by these small rituals of fire, by matches carefully coddled, kindling precisely arranged, fuel gathered with humble hands. And when the cabin grows warm enough that you feel sweat prickle at the back of your neck, even layered in all this wool, you'll understand something that goes beyond simple comfort. This stove, fed by chips and scraps and your own careful planning, isn't just heating air. It's keeping your heart steady, your mind sharp, your hope alive. Because in this vast, silent land of snow and biting wind, warmth is the line that divides mere existence from truly living another day. When you step back from the stove, feeling life return to your fingertips, your eyes inevitably wander across the modest space that holds you through these punishing seasons. This little cabin, with its sagging roof and walls that creak in protest each time the wind shifts, might seem barely more than a rough shed to someone raised in the safer, softer corners of the world. But here on the frontier, it stands as a fortress against forces that would gladly swallow you whole. Most settlers like you built what they could, with whatever the land grudgingly offered. For some, lucky enough to settle near stands of timber, that meant log cabins, walls made by notching heavy trunks at the corners and stacking them in interlocking rows. The gaps between were stuffed with whatever came to hand: mud, moss, strips of cloth, anything to slow the wind that loved to whistle through even the tiniest crack. In winter, frost would lace these seams on the inside, delicate fingers of ice that were strangely beautiful right up until they began melting and dripping onto your bedding. Logs gave a sense of sturdiness, a reassuring heft that made you believe you'd stay standing no matter how the storm raged outside. But they had their shortcomings too. Logs shifted and settled over time. Gaps widened. Insects found cozy tunnels in the moist wood. Sometimes you'd wake in the night to the faint sound of chewing, the slow destruction of your very walls by unseen jaws. And after a rain, the smell was a pungent mix of damp earth and rotting bark, a reminder that nature never fully relinquishes what it once claimed. Farther out on the open prairie, where a tree could be more rumor than reality, settlers turned to the ground itself. They built sod houses, soddies as they were called, cutting thick slabs of prairie turf, dense with roots that clung together like a natural quilt. These were stacked in overlapping rows, creating walls a foot thick or more, surprisingly good at holding in heat and shrugging off the worst of the wind's icy claws. Inside a sod house, the temperature stayed relatively stable, cooler in the blazing summers and warmer in the killing winters. But dirt is dirt. When it rained hard, the roof sometimes wept muddy tears onto your table, your blankets, your face if you were unlucky enough to lie beneath a seam that hadn't quite held. Insects made themselves at home too. Beetles and spiders, and sometimes far worse, burrowing deep into the sod walls, emerging at night to explore. And there were darker visitors still. Stories floated around campfires of snakes dropping down from sod ceilings into cribs or onto the startled faces of sleepers. Whether those tales were common or rare hardly mattered. The mere possibility was enough to quicken the breath.
For some, particularly those who found themselves where even good turf was scarce, or where wind cut so sharply across the plains that standing structures seemed foolish, there were dugouts. Homes scooped right out of hillsides or burrowed into level ground, supported by beams hauled from miles away or scavenged from whatever driftwood or scrap could be found. Dugouts were quick to build and cheap, needing only sweat and time. They offered exceptional insulation too, the earth itself forming thick, protective walls that neither sun nor blizzard could easily breach. But life underground came with a price. Dampness clung to everything, curling papers, rusting tools, creeping into lungs with each breath. The floors might be packed earth that turned to slippery muck when spring thaws sent water seeping in. Even with the best efforts, the smell of damp soil was constant, mixing with the acrid bite of smoke from poorly vented fires. And light. That was scarce. Many dugouts had only a small opening cut for a door, maybe a tiny glassless window covered in oiled cloth that let in a watery glow. On stormy days or after night fell, the interior was swallowed by a gloom that not even a well-fed lamp could fully conquer. Still, whether cabin, soddy, or dugout, these homes were lifelines. They wrapped around you like rough-hewn cocoons, imperfect yet vital. Each was a testament to human stubbornness, the refusal to simply lay down and accept what the cold and wind decreed. You learned quickly to keep your boots by the stove so they wouldn't stiffen into unyielding shapes overnight, to sweep constantly because any floor could become a trackway for small intruders. When rain turned dirt walls to weeping sludge, you patched and prayed. When logs settled until the door stuck tight, you shouldered it open and kept moving. In these places, the line between outside and inside was thin, sometimes laughably so. You could lie in bed at night, bundled under every blanket you owned, and hear the wind sneaking its icy fingers under the door. You'd wake to find snowdrifts pushed in through gaps in the walls or discover tiny mounds of earth scattered on your kitchen table where something had burrowed a little too eagerly.
But inside, despite every flaw, was still inside. It was where you could bank a fire, wrap your hands around a steaming mug, close your eyes and pretend for a moment that the world beyond those fragile walls was not waiting with sharpened teeth. And in that fragile shelter, you would sometimes sit back and marvel that you'd managed to carve out even this, a small, stubborn pocket of life where the heart could beat a little steadier and the breath didn't smoke quite so desperately in the air. No matter how humble or flawed, each of these frontier homes was a promise kept to yourself and those who huddled close around your hearth, that for one more day, you'd hold your ground against a wilderness that cared not at all whether you endured. Getting dressed in the heart of a frontier winter wasn't just a matter of modesty or habit, it was a calculated defense, a ritual armoring up against a world determined to steal the heat from your very bones. Each layer you pulled on in the dim, frost-laced light of morning was less about appearance and more about survival, a small decision that could tilt the balance between enduring another day or being laid low by a chill so deep it carved its mark into your flesh. It always began with the closest layer to your skin, the foundation on which everything else depended. That meant long underwear, often called long johns, made not of soft cotton like modern pajamas, but of thick, itchy wool or heavy flannel. Cotton was a traitor in these parts. It seemed harmless enough until it got wet, whether from sweat or melting snow, and then it clung to your skin like a greedy leech, drawing the heat out of your body with terrifying speed. More than one traveler underestimated this simple truth and paid for it, with blackened toes or fingers that never quite moved right again. The old saying was blunt and unforgiving: cotton kills. Wool, on the other hand, might itch and scratch at you like a nest of burrs, but it kept much of its insulating power even when damp, wicking moisture away and trapping precious warmth close to the skin. Over the long johns went shirts and trousers, themselves often made of wool or a dense, tightly woven canvas that resisted wind better than any polite city fabric. Men favored flannel shirts under thick wool vests, creating pockets of air between layers that trapped body heat. Women layered petticoats beneath their skirts, not delicate confections of lace, but heavy underskirts that added vital bulk, turning each stride into a deliberate effort, yet protecting them from the icy claws of the wind. Then came the true bulwarks against the cold. Coats so heavy they rested on your shoulders like slabs of meat, often stitched from woolen cloth lined with flannel, or, if fortune had smiled, edged with fur. Fur was the frontier's miracle material. It shrugged off snow, held warmth like a living thing, and added a layer of natural resilience that no weave could match. Beaver, rabbit, coyote, even remnants of buffalo found new purpose draped over human shoulders, their work of holding off winter simply continuing in a different form. A fur coat might look rough, pieced together from pelts of different shades and textures, but under its weight, you could step into air so cold it made your nostrils crack and still feel a measure of defiance. Legs needed attention too. Heavy wool trousers were common, often worn over yet another layer of underdrawers. Cowboys and ranch hands added leather chaps, not the shiny, decorative kind that would one day parade down rodeo grounds, but sturdy covers designed to break the wind and turn aside the brittle fingers of prairie grass or drifting ice. Some chaps were even made from shaggy hides, and Gorda goat hair left long so it moved in ghostly ripples when the wind blew, helping slow its passage and trap warmth close to the body. Feet were another matter altogether. Delicate battlegrounds where the war against frostbite was often lost. Multiple pairs of wool socks layered inside high leather boots, the boots themselves sometimes smeared with a mixture of beeswax and animal fat to keep out water. Some settlers wrapped strips of cloth around their feet and lower legs beneath the socks, adding yet another insulating barrier. Still, after hours trudging through knee-high drifts or standing motionless in a barn, toes would burn with that peculiar cold that promised more pain before relief ever came. You learned quickly to stamp your feet and flex your toes, to keep blood moving even when the rest of you longed to stand still. Hands fared best in mittens rather than gloves. With mittens, fingers could huddle together for shared warmth, a miniature community fighting off the chill. Often these were made with a layer of fur on the outside and lined with wool within, pulled up past the wrist to keep snow from sneaking in. Gloves separated each finger into its own lonely column, and on the frontier, loneliness was never your friend, not even for your hands.
And over it all, always a hat. Because no matter how careful you layered your torso or how sturdy your boots, an uncovered head leaked heat like a chimney. Wool caps pulled low over the ears were common, but the true prize was a fur hat with flaps that could be tied down under the chin, wrapping your head and neck in a fortress of dense warmth. Scarves or bandanas sometimes doubled around the lower face, a rough approximation of a mask that warmed each breath before it reached your lungs. In the depths of a blizzard, with wind shrieking around you like an angry spirit, that extra layer over mouth and nose could be the difference between skin that stung and skin that simply stopped feeling altogether. There were countless small tricks, too, passed along from neighbor to neighbor, from old-timers to wide-eyed newcomers still blinking in the savage light of their first prairie winter. Keeping tomorrow's clothes under the blankets with you at night so they wouldn't freeze into rigid shapes by morning. Heating small stones in the fire, wrapping them in cloth and dropping them into boots before putting them on. Rubbing a bit of snow on bare skin that had gone numb, paradoxical but true, because it might stimulate circulation enough to avoid worse injury. Each piece of clothing, each layer, each clever little tactic was part of an unspoken pact between human bodies and the pitiless environment they chose to inhabit. The clothing didn't just ward off cold, it broadcast a message to the wilderness itself. You may surround me, press in at every seam, howl around my eaves and scour the very breath from my chest, but you will not have me. Not today. And maybe not tomorrow either. So you bundle up each morning, wrapping yourself in the combined wisdom of countless settlers who learned the hard way how to dress for a place that offered no mercy. With every button fastened, every scarf wound tight, you felt the subtle promise in all that wool and hide and fur, that for another day at least, you'd keep your warmth close, your life firmly staked inside your own fragile, stubborn skin. Outside, the cold waits like a living thing, pressing its silent face against the door, eager to rush in the instant you open it. But there's no putting it off. Animals need tending long before your own belly gets full, and every minute counts when the temperature bites so sharply it threatens to steal breath straight from your lungs. You brace yourself, drawing in one last lungful of warmer air by the stove, and then lift the latch and step out into a world painted white and gray, the horizon blurred where earth meets sky under a shifting blanket of low clouds.
Snow crunches underfoot with a sound that is strangely loud in the muffled stillness. The path you packed down yesterday already needs breaking again. Drifts lie like frozen waves across your yard, smooth on top but deceptive, sometimes giving way so your leg plunges down past the knee, sending a spark of shock all the way up your spine. Ahead stands your small barn, more a leaning shack than a proper building, but it blocks the wind well enough and keeps your animals alive. A thin tendril of worry winds through your chest with each step. What if last night's cold was too much for them? You've heard stories of settlers finding cattle frozen on their feet in the morning, lifeless statues half buried in powder. Inside the barn, it's warmer by a margin so slim only someone who's lived months out here would notice. The breath of the animals billows around you in damp, ghostly puffs, their bodies clustered close to steal heat from each other. Your milk cow blinks at you, eyes rimmed with frost where tears have frozen. Chickens shift on their perches, feathers fluffed as thickly as possible. A mule stamps impatiently, as if demanding you hurry up with whatever comfort you've brought. The water trough is topped with a slab of ice nearly 2 inches thick. You work it carefully with the back of your axe, striking so it splits without shattering into too many jagged chunks that could hurt an animal nosing for a drink. Each swing sends jolts up your arms that almost rival the cold in their sting. You clear enough space so the livestock can push their muzzles in, drinking greedily, small movements that send ripples through the thin skin of water already trying to crust over again. Then feed. The hay stacked close by, protected under a heavy canvas, though each time you lift it, snow finds its way in. You ration it out with a discipline born of necessity, not because you're hard-hearted, but because winter might stretch longer than the piles allow, and starving slowly is a cruelty you'd rather avoid for your animals and yourself. Grain, if you have it, scattered out with quick hands, though fewer handfuls than they'd like. Their eyes follow your movements with silent hope that is hard to meet for long. Outside the barn, you pause, scanning the sky. Settlers who've lived through more winters than you can count on your hands say the signs are always there if you care to look. Today, the clouds hang heavy and close, a shifting ceiling the color of old pewter, moving almost imperceptibly. No sharp blue, no dancing sunlight on crusted snow, only that oppressive gray pressing lower. You notice birds, or rather the lack of them. In summer, the yard bustles with noisy sparrows and bold blackbirds, but today it's eerily still. Even the crows, usually so content to stalk across snowy ground picking for scraps, seem to have vanished. There's a scent to the air, too, though you can't quite name it, something flat and metallic, the way iron tastes on your tongue. Old-timers nod knowingly when you mention it. Snow scent, they mutter, as if that explains everything. And in a way it does. The land carries warnings and subtleties, a sudden quiet in the woods, the way smoke from your chimney drifts oddly sideways instead of rising. Sometimes the wind dies altogether, leaving a breathless hush that's almost more frightening than its constant moan. You finish your circuit of chores quickly. Back at the cabin, you check the woodpile again, eyeing it with a twinge of unease. You have enough for now, but if this storm is what you suspect, you'll burn through it faster than you'd like. You bring more inside, stacking it by the stove until the corner looks like a miniature forest laid low. Then you glance at your stores, sacks of flour, a dwindling crock of salt pork, the last few jars of preserved berries from a summer that feels like another lifetime. You make a quick count, running the numbers in your head. Could be enough, might not be, depending on how long you're trapped. All the while, your thoughts circle back to that sky, to the strange hush of the land, to the way your animals moved with a restless energy that set your own heart pacing. Some part of you longs to dismiss it as overthinking. Winter is always harsh here, always demands watchfulness. But there's a deeper instinct, older than you, whispering that storms often sneak up while the mind tries to argue against them. So you trust the signs more than your comfort. You haul water buckets to keep inside where they won't freeze solid. Check that every seam in the window coverings is secure. Lay out the matches once more in easy reach. Even pull down extra blankets, piling them on the bed, though it's still early. When you catch yourself doing this, you almost laugh. Preparing so carefully for something that hasn't yet arrived might look like fear. But on the frontier, it's only wisdom, a quiet, practiced respect for forces that give no second chances. By the time you allow yourself to sit again by the stove, you're half listening for a change in the wind, for that first soft patter of snow thick enough to swallow up the last fragile sounds of the world outside. Each tick of the cooling stove, each creak of the settling roof presses its own small urgency into your chest. Because out here, once the storm begins in earnest, you won't be able to do much more than wait. And you'll be glad for every cautious step taken now, each one a slender shield against the long, cold hours to come. It doesn't begin with a roar. The first true assault of winter sneaks in with almost deceptive softness, as though the land is playing a gentle trick. You stand by the small window, mug of steaming liquid cupped in your hands, watching fat flakes drift lazily from that iron-gray sky. They seem harmless, even pretty, settling on the sill in delicate star shapes that vanish the instant you touch them. You catch yourself thinking how quiet it is, how peaceful, almost forgetting that this is how every serious storm starts. Then the snowfall thickens. Slowly at first, so your mind wants to deny it. Just a bit more snow, surely, nothing to fret over. But the flakes pile up in hours, what used to take days. By the time evening presses down in its early winter fashion, the world outside has been swallowed by a shifting curtain of white. You open the door for a moment, peering out into a swirl that stings your cheeks instantly. The familiar path to the barn is already gone, replaced by drifts whose depths your eye can't judge. The wind hasn't fully risen yet, but there's a pulse to it, a low moan that comes and goes as if the air itself is waking up, deciding whether to turn cruel. That's when the old instincts kick in. This isn't a snow you watch idly, it's one you meet with careful haste. You pull on coat and hat and step outside again, squinting into the quickening flurry. The first task is the rope. You keep a coil of it hanging by the door for precisely this reason. As you unwind it, the snow tries to fill your collar, tiny cold pinpricks racing down your back. You stretch the line from the cabin door all the way to the barn, tying it off in taut knots around posts you drove into the ground long before the freeze came. Each knot is a small promise that when the storm truly hits and sight is useless, your hand will know the way even if your eyes do not. Next is wood. You've been stacking it by the cabin for weeks, but that pile shrinks faster than seems fair in weather like this. You drag more inside, splinters catching on your mittens, arms trembling from the weight. Each armload you toss by the stove feels like adding hours to your safety. Not comfort. Comfort is a dream long put aside, but sheer survival, a way to keep frost from crawling into your lungs and hollowing you out from the inside. Food comes next. Inside your cabin, you rearrange supplies again, placing dried beans, flour, salt pork within the easiest reach. You pull up a small crate from under the bed, jars of fruit preserved in syrup last summer, their bright colors dim in the lamplight, yet still a promise of life. You tuck them into a cabinet near the stove where they might avoid freezing solid if the worst comes and the fire fails. Everything is placed with thought, no rummaging when your fingers are numb and the lamp oil is low. By now, night has fully fallen, though through the tiny glass pane you can hardly tell it's any darker than the storm-lit afternoon. The wind begins its rise in earnest. It doesn't howl at first. It sighs, gathering breath, rushing around corners and finding cracks you thought you'd sealed. A thin trail of snow sneaks in under the door, drifting across the floor in a delicate stripe. It's oddly beautiful, the way it snakes forward until you brush it aside with your boot. But you know better than to admire it too long. Beauty out here can be nothing more than danger wearing a pleasant mask. As the storm builds, you add even more layers of defense. Extra blankets are draped over the door, pinned around the window frames, anything to block the sly tendrils of cold that sneak in with every gust. You check your matches again, count them by feel, reassure yourself of where each candle is placed. A single misstep, forgetting where the lantern sits, knocking it over in a sleepy stumble, could mean far more than just darkness. Through all this, your heart keeps a steady, fast rhythm, driven by a worry that never fully goes away during a winter like this. You think of neighbors, scattered miles apart on their own plots of land. You wonder if they've strung their ropes yet, stacked enough wood, if their cattle have found shelter. Out here, each homestead feels like a tiny ship on a vast, frigid sea.
The storm sweeps through with no concern for fences or property lines, and it tests every person's preparations with an impartial hand. Finally, with everything set as best you can make it, you sit near the stove again. You let your muscles go slack, though only partly. There's a tension that never quite leaves, a readiness to jump up if a sudden draft hints at a door blown open, or if the stove coughs a dangerous spark. You watch the firelight flicker on the walls, listen to the wind climb from whisper to wail. Snow rattles against the cabin like dry seeds shaken in a hollow gourd. And in the spaces between gusts, there's a peculiar hush that makes you hold your breath. This is the first real test of the season, and you meet it with everything you've learned. The rope from door to barn, the careful rationing of food close at hand, the extra wood stacked high. These are not superstitions or old wives' tales. They're the distillation of hard-earned knowledge, passed down by those who watched storms roll in over the flat land long before your hands ever swung an axe here. And as the storm presses its full weight against your cabin walls, howling now in a voice that seems almost gleeful, you realize you've become part of that long, stubborn tradition, doing what you can, trusting it will be enough, and waiting out the night while winter rages just inches beyond your fragile walls.
The true voice of the storm finds you deep into the night, long after your tired eyes first began drooping near the stove. It's a sound that starts as a low groan somewhere out beyond the cabin walls, then swells into a howl that vibrates the very timbers. Each new blast seems to circle the little house, probing for weaknesses, clawing at the roof, rattling the door latch with sharp insistence as if to demand entry. Inside, the cold grows sly, creeping in places you thought were secure. Snow works its way through hairline cracks, carried on tiny drafts that slither across the floor and find your ankles. It piles in ghostly drifts along the base of the door, collects in window corners, forms delicate rhymes along nails and hinges. When you run your palm over the logs of the inner wall, they're so chilled it feels like touching stone pulled from deep underground. Each breath sends out a cloud of white that hangs in the air before slowly dissolving, a silent testament to just how thin the barrier is between you and the raging world outside. You cluster closer to the stove, which has become the center of your entire existence. Its iron belly radiates a pocket of heat, small and stubborn. The nearer you stand, the more the warmth seeps into your bones. A few feet farther, and the air already feels sharp, hostile. You've learned to live within this narrow ring, where your fingers regain feeling and your shoulders unclench from their instinctive hunch. The stove itself groans and ticks as it expands and contracts, the wood inside crackling as if complaining about being burned alive. Now and then, a coal pops violently, sending a spark pinging against the grate. You lean forward, wary, always ready to bat down any ember that dares to jump free. To keep the heat alive, you feed the stove almost tenderly, a careful rhythm, 2 small pieces of wood, then a buffalo chip, then perhaps a thicker log once the flames roar. Each offering is judged by eye, by years of instinct. Too much, and you'll choke the fire, smother it with your own desperation. Too little, and the cold will creep in stronger, slipping over the edges of the stove's weak circle of influence until you shiver and your teeth begin their helpless chatter. Even the sound of your breath changes outside that warm halo, growing harsher, edged with tiny shivers of frost.
Sometimes you squat on your heels, right in front of the stove door, stretching out your hands until they almost burn, then flipping them palm up to warm the backs. Your boots steam where melting snow evaporates off the leather. You can smell the faint pungency of damp wool, the sharper note of scorched fibers if you get too close. You shift often, chasing comfort, as if your body is a compass needle, forever trying to find true north in that little oasis of warmth. Beyond this ring of heat, the cabin transforms into something else entirely. Frost blooms on your table. The water bucket, pushed into a corner, has a crust of ice you'll have to break come morning. Your bedding lies in stiff heaps that dare you to slip inside when the time comes. Even your breath, when it drifts past the stove's invisible boundary, seems to falter and fall faster, as if the cold snatches it greedily from the air. You find yourself listening to the storm as though it were a living creature prowling just outside. The wind claws at the gaps between logs, slips under the door in long sighs that snake around your ankles. Now and then, it strikes the cabin squarely, making the whole structure shudder. Snow rattles against the window in hard pellets, sounding like thrown gravel. At moments like these, you hold yourself still, heart hammering, rationally expecting some monstrous weight to collapse the roof and spill all that fury inside. But it doesn't. The cabin groans, shifts a little, then settles again. You breathe out slowly, a soft plume that catches the stove's glow. Reassured for now, you turn your attention back to the fire. You poke it with a stick, stirring coals until they pulse red and new flames curl up through the gaps. You add another piece of wood. Listen for the quick sigh as it catches. Each small success feels bigger than it should, an intimate victory over forces far too large to ever fully conquer. So you keep tending this fragile flame. You feed it not just fuel, but your attention, your will, your stubbornness. Around it, your small world continues, narrow but sufficient. You might brew a bit of broth, eating it directly from the pot because carrying it even a few steps means losing too much heat. You check your matches again, feeling for them in your pocket like a nervous habit. You glance at your stacked wood, calculating with tired eyes how long it might last if the storm stretches for days. And all the while, just beyond the reach of your fragile hearth, winter waits. It presses its cold face against every seam of your home, hissing through cracks, searching for invitation. You've come to understand it's less an enemy to be defeated than a vast, indifferent force, something you endure, hold off minute by minute with every scrap of knowledge and care you've gathered since the first snow fell. And in the center of it all stands this tiny stove, its glow painting your hands and dancing gold and shadow, the line between survival and surrender, traced in nothing more than the shape of a small, stubborn circle of warmth.
Night tightens around your cabin like a heavy lid, sealing you into a world where the only light comes from the stove's faint, shifting glow and the soft, uncertain flicker of a single candle. Outside, the storm prowls with fresh energy, its voice rising and falling in mournful howls that wrap around the walls. Each gust seems to search deliberately for weaknesses, probing the seams between logs, rattling the door latch in a way that feels almost personal. The wind pushes against the structure so fiercely that the whole cabin seems to inhale, then creak and sigh out again, boards settling with low, uneasy groans that set your teeth on edge. You lie bundled under a mound of blankets and hides, trying to find rest, but real sleep slips away each time you come close. The wind will drop for a heartbeat, leaving an eerie, oppressive stillness, only to return with a sudden shriek that makes your heart lurch. When that happens, your eyes fly open to the dim rafters overhead, tracing the lines where frost has begun to lace along the beams. You listen hard, trying to decide if that pop was just the stove adjusting, or something outside, or worse, inside, shifting under the weight of snow. In these hours, fears that seem laughable by day creep close, curling up like cold fingers around your thoughts. Old stories slip back into your head unbidden, tales whispered by settlers huddled around fires in cabins much like yours. Stories of spirits that ride the wind, looking for cracks to slip through. Of icy wraiths that drift from homestead to homestead, laying their touch on sleeping foreheads. You're not someone who admits to believing such things. By daylight, you'd scoff with a wry shake of your head. But night is a different realm, and the boundary between sense and superstition grows thin when every shadow seems to move just beyond the edge of your vision. You try to calm yourself by focusing on the familiar, the faint ticking of a metal kettle shifting on the stove, the dry rustle of your blankets when you turn, the softer breathing of your own body under the pile of covers. You become deeply aware of your own warmth, how precious it feels to have that little nest of heat cradled around you, a fragile victory against a cold so absolute that stepping beyond it, even for a moment, seems like tempting fate. Each time you inhale, the air inside your blankets fills your lungs with a gentle humidity that smells faintly of wool and wood smoke, a small reassurance that you are still here, still alive. Your thoughts drift to neighbors, scattered across the snowy expanse, each in their own isolated refuge. You picture other cabins dotted across the land, tiny islands of flickering light in a vast ocean of dark. Somewhere out there, someone else is surely lying awake too, eyes wide in the gloom, listening to the same ferocious choir of the storm. Perhaps they're remembering similar stories of ghost lights moving across fields or creatures scratching at windows with frozen claws. It's almost comforting to imagine you're not alone in this strange vigil, that across miles of white nothingness, hearts beat fast with the same mingled dread and awe. Eventually, fear transforms into something quieter. Maybe it's simple exhaustion, or maybe your mind finds a grudging peace in the rhythm of the storm's battering. You start to notice, almost with surprise, the incredible fortune of simply being warm. Each howling blast outside only makes the cocoon you've made for yourself feel more dear. The stove ticks and pings softly as it digests the last log you fed it, a faithful old creature muttering to itself in contentment. You press your hand to the nearest heavy blanket and feel its reassuring weight pinning you gently to the straw mattress below. Thankfulness grows in place of fear, not grand gratitude, but a small, fierce gladness that tonight the cold can't reach you here, not fully. That you had enough sense to split extra wood, to line the gaps in the walls with rags, to pull down every quilt you owned. Outside may rage with all its fury, a white hell swirling just beyond the flimsy door, but inside you've carved out a fragile bastion where your breath fogs less, where your fingers stay pink and supple. It feels miraculous, even holy in its way. The wind shifts again, sending a new pattern of groans through the walls, and your eyes flick open once more. But instead of raw fear, there's a steady acceptance. Let it roar. You've done all you could, stacked every defense you know how to build against it. Wrapped in this imperfect shield of blankets and prayers and hard-earned skill, you drift toward a shallow, restless sleep. Somewhere in the darkness, the storm continues its haunting song, but for now, it stays on the other side of your stubborn, human warmth. And in that simple fact lies a victory as profound as any legend ever told.
When morning finally pries open the dark with a dim gray light, the storm has spent itself. The wind still prowls in tired gusts across the yard, but its fury has faded, leaving behind towering drifts that reshape the familiar landscape into an alien world of rolling white. As you push open the door, it sticks stubbornly against the snow, packed high against it, finally yielding with a sharp crack that sends a small avalanche spilling across your boots. The cold outside feels different now, Still brutal, still quick to sting exposed skin, but hushed in the way a battlefield quiets after the chaos passes. You pause there on the threshold, taking it all in. The roof of your shed is nearly buried. Fences vanish under smooth banks. The track to the barn has vanished completely, replaced by a treacherous surface that hides holes and lumps ready to twist an ankle. Somewhere nearby, the muffled shape of a tree leans under the weight of so much snow, branches drooping like tired arms. But your mind isn't only on your own patch of ground. Out here, life is woven together by invisible threads that stretch across miles of prairie. As much as the frontier teaches self-reliance, it also builds a quiet understanding that your fate is tangled up with the fates of others. After a storm like this, neighbors become more than distant specks on the horizon. They become part of the same fragile fabric that keeps the wilderness from swallowing you all whole. So you pull on your heaviest coat, wrap a scarf twice around your neck until your breath fogs your eyelashes, and strike out toward the nearest homestead. Each step sinks deep, snow squealing underfoot, and your legs burn from the effort of lifting them free again. In the silent cold, your own labored breathing seems strangely loud. There's comfort, though, in seeing faint wisps of smoke rise from distant chimneys, proof that others made it through the night, that stoves still burn, and hearts still beat. When you reach your neighbor's door, you knock gently, not wanting to startle anyone already keyed up by days of relentless wind. Faces appear, cautious at first, then easing into tired smiles that mirror your own. No one launches into excited chatter. That's not the way of these parts. Instead, there's a shared look that says more than words. We're still here. The unspoken relief flows between you, warming your chest in a way no stove ever could.
Inside, you trade small news. How your stove held up, how the animals fared, how close the drifts came to blocking the chimney. You might learn that someone lost a chicken to the cold, or found the pump frozen solid. Small hardships that sting, but aren't yet ruin. And then there's the quiet ritual of sharing. Maybe you brought a sack of dried beans, or a jar of preserves tucked carefully in your coat to keep it from cracking in the freeze. They press on you a wedge of hard cheese, or a bit of lard they can spare. No one says outright that this is charity. It isn't. It's insurance. The simple mutual understanding that next week, or the next storm, it might be you standing with your hands empty while someone else opens their door. Sometimes help is less about food and more about being there. You might lend a shoulder to clear a collapsed shed roof, or watch over children while neighbors dig out pens so livestock can move again. Hands working together make short business of chores that would take hours alone. And even though your own breath puffs white with each effort, something eases in your mind, knowing you're not fighting this winter entirely by yourself. When it's time to return home, you step back into the hush of the snowfields with a grateful nod. The path you trudge carves a slender artery through the drifts, connecting one fragile outpost to another. Later, others might follow your footprints, bringing news or a small bundle of firewood, a warm loaf of bread that smelled too good not to share. These simple visits are as vital as any stockpile. They patch up the soul, reminding you that beyond the tight circle of your cabin walls, a quiet fellowship endures. By the time you reach your own door, the cold has gnawed deep into your bones. But inside, as you remove layers crusted with ice and stack them by the stove, you feel something else working through your veins besides lingering chill. It's the pulse of that shared resilience, the sense that out here, on this broad, pitiless frontier, survival isn't merely a solitary act. It's a collective breath, drawn in by many hearts scattered across the snow, exhaled again in small acts of trust and generosity. And knowing that tomorrow, should need come scratching at your door, someone will stand there just as ready to help. That is a comfort more profound than any pile of blankets ever could be. Not every winter on the frontier was created equal. Some were harsh but survivable, chapters in the long ledger of hardships that settlers quietly endured and then set aside when spring finally broke through. But the winter of 1886 to 1887
carved itself into memory with a cruel sharpness that would never fully dull. It came down on the West like a silent hammer, shattering assumptions, crushing dreams, and marking the beginning of the end for a way of life that had seemed as boundless as the open plains themselves.
They called it the Great Die-Up, a grim phrase that spread from campfire to saloon to distant homesteads on the wind. It wasn't coined out of drama, but sheer necessity. There was no softer language to fit the staggering scale of what unfolded. By the time spring stumbled in months later, the land was littered with carcasses, the silent remains of herds that had once darkened entire valleys with their numbers. The trouble began innocently enough in the fall. Across the plains, ranchers and cowboys watched their cattle graze on what seemed ample grass, fattening nicely as the weather turned crisp. In that era of open range, fences were rare, and livestock wandered for miles, tended only by the loose vigilance of cowhands who trusted the natural bounty of the land to keep them strong. Few bothered to put up hay or build serious shelters. After all, the West was vast, the seasons usually forgiving enough. Snow would fall, but it often blew clear or melted quickly under a friendly sun. But that year was different. December opened with temperatures plunging far below what most men or beasts had prepared for. Blizzards slammed across the plains, day after relentless day, laying down a white sheet that turned into a deadly crust. The snow thawed slightly under brief sunny spells, then froze again into a hard armor that hooves couldn't break. Cattle pawed desperately at the icy surface, eyes wide with confusion and growing hunger, finding only the bitter air. As weeks passed, more storms rolled in. Winds howled so viciously that they drove drifts against cabins and barns until doors wouldn't open, until windows disappeared beneath white walls of snow. Out on the range, thousands upon thousands of cattle began to drift too, pushed by instinct and panic. They moved blindly with the wind, searching for anything to eat, forming ghostly processions that left tangled trails in the snow. Cowboys riding out in the bitter cold would come upon scenes almost too painful to bear. Steers frozen standing up, still angled towards some imagined patch of grass just beyond reach, their hides rimed with frost so thick it turned them into statues. Then came January, and with it temperatures so savage that mercury dropped from sight altogether in glass tubes. Men who ventured out found their beards crusted solid with ice within minutes. The simplest task, cutting a hole in a creek to water horses, digging out a drifted shed, became a test of endurance. Fingers went stiff, noses whitened. Out on the plains, cattle couldn't stand the punishment. They dropped where they stood, ribs showing under stretched hides, eyes glazed in misery that finally dulled into nothing. Even strong herds that had survived past winters began to founder.
By February, the scope of the disaster was undeniable. Riders pushing through waist-deep snow discovered entire stretches of prairie littered with carcasses, piled up in creek beds or caught against stands of brush, tangled together as if in one last communal attempt to find shelter. Estimates vary, but by spring it was clear that anywhere from half to as much as 3/4 of some herds were gone. The numbers were staggering. Entire fortunes vanished under drifts, driven off not by thieves or market crashes, but by a season that refused to relent. For many ranchers, especially those running sprawling outfits financed on debt and hopeful speculation, the winter was a final blow. With so many animals lost, there was no revenue to pay hands, no money to settle with suppliers. Operations collapsed almost overnight. Men who'd swaggered through town just months before, flush with the confidence of owning thousands of head of cattle, now found themselves picking up stakes, leaving behind land dotted with sun-bleached bones that told the story of dreams trampled by a silent, merciless force. In the aftermath, the entire philosophy of ranching shifted. The era of the open range, that grand vision of endless herds roaming unfenced across a continent, began to close. Lessons learned at brutal cost reshaped the industry. Fences went up, stretching across the plains in long, stubborn lines of barbed wire. Ranchers began putting up hay against the day when snow might come deeper than anyone wished. Smaller, contained herds replaced the vast wandering masses. More barns rose, crude and drafty perhaps, but enough to cut the wind, enough to save animals from the worst. And somewhere under all this practical change lay a deeper alteration. The winter of 1886-1887 burned away a certain innocence. It reminded all who lived through it that however broad the sky or rich the grass, the West belonged first and always to forces beyond any brand or deed. It was a place where nature still held the upper hand, where cold could rule like a monarch, and where survival hinged on humility before powers no man could tame. So when folks spoke of the great die-up in the years that followed, there was a haunted look that came over their faces, a pause as if listening for the old wind again. It was more than a season, more than a financial calamity. It was a collective reckoning, the bitter past of learning that out here, the land grants its bounty only on its own terms, and sometimes takes it back with breathtaking speed, leaving nothing behind but silent fields and hard new wisdom carved deep into the hearts of those who stayed.
Long before the first hard frost settled into the ground, animals seemed to sense what was coming. Horses grew shaggy with thick winter coats, their breath steaming in great clouds as they pulled it in and out of lungs that had learned, over countless generations, how to survive air so cold it felt sharp enough to cut. Cattle fattened on summer's grasses carried that bounty into the lean months, layers of muscle and fat their only insurance against the bitter winds soon to scour the plains. But once the real cold arrived, the kind that locked water solid in troughs and painted the insides of barns with delicate frost patterns, instinct alone wasn't always enough. Herds of cattle, left largely to their own devices on the vast open range, would bunch together in tight clusters when the mercury fell. They stood flank to flank, steam rising from the mass of their bodies, tails turned toward the prevailing wind. In the middle of these living knots, it was surprisingly warm. The outer layer of animals bore the brunt of the cold, their hides caked in snow that sometimes melted slightly from body heat, then refroze into frosty armor. If the storm was long and fierce, those outermost cattle might not rise again when the herd shifted, the sacrifice that helped the others last just a little longer. Horses did much the same, gathering into huddles with heads lowered, manes crusted with frost. Often, if left to roam too freely, they'd drift before the wind for miles, searching for shelter or exposed patches of grass. Cowboys riding out after a storm sometimes found them miles from where they'd been last seen, ribs showing through their heavy coats, eyes wide and wary. Getting them back to water or feed could be a desperate affair, pushing half-wild, half-frozen beasts across terrain that hid its dangers under innocent-looking snow. Closer to homesteads and smaller farms, people fought to give their animals every extra chance. Barns and lean-tos, even if crude and drafty, offered vital breaks from the wind. Farmers often banked snow along the outside walls on purpose, packing it tight to add insulation, a trick that felt backward but worked remarkably well, keeping the worst of the cold from slipping through gaps in the rough boards. Inside, straw bedding was heaped generously. It did more than provide a soft place to lie. It insulated from the frozen ground, kept hooves and bellies from drawing the killing chill that seeped up relentlessly through bare dirt floors. Cattle that would normally sleep wherever they pleased learned quickly to bed down on these piles, pressed together, lowing softly in the dark. Farmers trudged through waist-high drifts with pitchforks, moving hay into feed racks, spreading out grain if they had it, anything to keep the animals' guts working. An active stomach was almost as important as a warm hide. Digestion itself created heat, helped stave off the cold gnawing from inside out. Water was a constant worry. Troughs froze overnight into solid blocks, so every morning began with the brutal chore of chopping and prying, sending shards of ice flying in glittering arcs. If a well was nearby, fresh water had to be hauled in bucket after bucket, each trip numbing hands and stiffening backs. Some settlers rigged simple systems to carry water inside the barn, little more than barrels topped off daily and kept from freezing by sheer proximity to the warm, breathing mass of livestock. Even so, more than one animal went thirsty on the coldest days, when it was all anyone could do to keep the life inside them burning. People watched their stock with the same sharp eye they used on each other in hard times. A cow that hung back from feed or seemed slow to rise might not see another dawn. Farmers rubbed legs and ears to restore circulation, wrapped burlap or old blankets around shivering calves. In especially brutal snaps, they might bring the youngest or weakest animals right into the house itself. Stories lingered for years about families who shared their single-room cabins with bleeding lambs or calves stumbling over hearthstones, the air inside thick with the mingled smells of smoke, damp wool, and frightened life. Humans relied on many of the same basic tactics. They layered up in every scrap of wool, fur, or patched canvas they owned, slept in heaps under mounds of quilts, sometimes even crowding into the same bed for warmth. Meals were hearty and frequent: beans, salted pork, thick stews, because a full belly meant more than satisfaction. It was fuel, a small internal fire that helped fight off the cold. Even children learned quickly not to waste time by the door, not to open it without reason, not to linger when chores took them outside. And through it all, there was a shared watchfulness. Neighbors checked on each other when storms broke. They rode out to look over fences and corrals, to lend a hand digging out a barn door drifted shut. They traded hay when one family ran low, passed around news of who had lost animals and who still had extra feed to spare. In a winter that seemed bent on testing every living thing, people and beasts alike depended on each other in ways that went beyond mere survival. It forged a kind of bond that couldn't be undone by thaw or spring rains. In those months when breath froze hard in the air and snow creaked underfoot like breaking glass, everyone, four-legged or two, lived by the same raw instinct: to stay close, to share what warmth they could, and to wait out the cold together.
In the depths of a frontier winter, food wasn't simply comfort. It was survival in its purest, most urgent form. Each bite was another small promise that your body could keep pushing heat outward, that your heart would keep pumping blood warm enough to reach your fingertips, that breath wouldn't turn shallow from hunger's weakening grip. Out here, long months sealed in by snow made every scrap of stored food a precious kind of fuel, measured and guarded with a seriousness city folk might reserve for gold. Much of this started long before the first flurries ever fell. In late summer and fall, smokehouses dotted the homestead landscapes, their chimneys puffing steady gray plumes into skies still bright and blue. Inside, slabs of meat hung from thick hooks or simple rafters: venison, beef, pork, even strings of fish when the catch had been kind. Fires smoldered beneath, fed with slow-burning woods like hickory or oak that imparted a deep, almost sweet aroma. This wasn't fast cooking. It was a slow ritual of hours and days, drawing out moisture, sealing in fat, replacing the wet vulnerability of raw flesh with a dense, smoky resilience that could last for months without spoiling. Salting was equally vital.
Whole barrels were packed with coarse salt, layered between cuts of meat, a crude yet reliable preservation that pulled out liquid and kept rot at bay. When meat was needed, it was hauled from its brine, soaked to soften the overwhelming salt bite, then boiled long and slow, often with whatever onions or herbs might still be stored in a root cellar. The result might be tough by any modern kitchen standard, but it filled bellies and fed that inner furnace against the cold. Drying worked alongside smoking and salting, especially for leaner cuts and smaller game. Thin strips of meat were hung in airy sheds or sometimes right above hearths in the kitchen, letting the low heat and circulating air pull out moisture until they were reduced to tough, chewy cords. These could be eaten as they were or chopped into stews that softened them back toward tenderness. Vegetables had their own careful rituals. Root cellars, dugouts beneath cabins or separate low buildings dug into hillsides, were cool and dark, protected from frost by layers of earth and sometimes lined with straw. Inside lay piles of potatoes, carrots, turnips, onions, all harvested at their peak and packed away to wait out the season. You might also find apples wrapped in cloth or laid out in wooden bins, slowly softening as winter wore on, but still sweet enough to remind you what autumn once tasted like.
Among the most prized stores was pemmican, a food borrowed and adapted from indigenous knowledge that had shaped survival on these lands long before settlers ever arrived. Made by grinding dried lean meat into a coarse powder, mixing it with rendered fat, and often adding crushed berries, pemmican was astonishingly dense in energy. A small lump in your palm contained enough calories to keep a person going for hours of labor in bitter cold. It was portable, slow to spoil, and required no cooking. When blizzards pinned families inside for days, pemmican could make the difference between keeping strength or fading fast. Fat was far more valued than sweetness. People might daydream of pies and cakes, but in practice they craved lard, tallow, bacon grease. Fats burned longer in the body, producing that slow, steady internal warmth so vital in a world where fires sometimes went out or wood ran low. A stew rich with marrow or a thick slice of salt pork fried crisp didn't just satisfy, it stoked the coals inside you, pushing back against the creeping chill that waited to slip under collars and sleeves. And always there was the specter of scurvy, that slow thief of health brought on by a lack of fresh greens and fruits. Some settlers managed by carefully storing root vegetables or foraging late into fall for berries to dry. Others turned to pickles and preserved sauerkraut, which offered just enough of the vital acids to fend off swollen gums and aching joints. Pine-needled tea became another unlikely ally. A handful of green needles steeped in hot water delivered a surprising dose of vitamin C, even if the taste was something you learned to endure more than enjoy. Every part of the winter diet was deliberate, honed by generations of trial and hard necessity. Meals weren't designed for pleasure alone, but for endurance. Thick stews simmered all day on the stove, flavors melding from scraps of smoked meat, root vegetables, sometimes a bit of dried apple or onion tossed in to round it out. Hard bread, often stale by this point, softened when dunked into the broth. Children learned early not to complain about sameness or lack of fancy dishes. Every steaming bowl was a ward against the cold, a small shield your body could carry with it back out into the wind. So in those long months when the world beyond the cabin door lay locked under heaps of silent white, people didn't just eat to live. They measured out each portion as carefully as firewood, knowing it had to last, knowing that inside every salty bite of smoked meat or oily smear of fat lay another day's worth of heat. It was a partnership with food far more intimate than anything the well-fed cities knew. A constant, life-affirming pact that said, "You keep me warm from within,
and I'll keep feeding the flames that let me wake to see another dawn.
Day after day, in the depths of winter, took on a sameness so heavy it seemed to press down on your shoulders just as surely as the cold itself. Each dawn broke gray and reluctant, with no brilliant sunrise to scatter the shadows, only a gradual easing from dark to dim. Often it was hard to tell where one day ended and the next began, so tightly did the hours knit together in their repeating, grinding pattern. The first and most urgent task every morning was the fire. Even with the stove banked carefully the night before, its coals often hovered at the edge of dying by dawn. You'd wake to a room rimmed in frost, your breath blooming white above your blankets, and your hands would tremble with urgency as you poked through ash, hunting for a stubborn glow. Sometimes you found nothing but a dull, cold heap, and then you worked with growing desperation, piling on shreds of bark, splinters of wood shaved off with your knife, willing a match to catch and flare. When it finally did, your chest eased with relief, almost as profound as any prayer answered. Warmth wasn't a luxury, it was the day's permission to begin. Next came water. Outside, every bucket and trough was frozen into solid lumps. If the weather was forgiving enough, you might chop through ice on the creek or the well, though even then you had to haul heavy sloshing pails back through drifts that threatened to swallow your legs. More often, you found yourself ladling snow into iron pots on the stove, watching it collapse into disappointing puddles, then adding more again and again, until at last you had enough to drink or cook with. Water for animals meant even more trips, your shoulders aching under the yoke, or carrying buckets by each hand, fingertips stinging where the wet rope handles bit through your mittens. Caring for the livestock never waited. You broke open ice crusts so cattle could drink, forked down hay from lofts that dwindled each week, spread bedding anew so bellies wouldn't rest against frozen ground. The animals greeted you with low, plaintive sounds that somehow managed to say both gratitude and demand. Horses nosed your shoulder, breath warm against your cheek, as if reminding you they too had to stand out in the raw wind and needed every scrap of attention you could stare. Then there were the endless small repairs that winter insisted upon. Hinges swelled or cracked, latches refused to catch. Snow piled on roofs so heavily that you worried about collapse, forcing you up slippery ladders with a broom or shovel to clear it away. Cold made everything brittle. Leather harness straps snapped, wooden handles split, even your own fingernails seemed more prone to cracking. You kept tools always close by, sharpening the axe or whittling replacement pegs by lamplight in the evenings, because tomorrow would surely present something else that needed fixing.
Inside the cabin, chores crowded each narrow space. Someone stirred the stew pot again, scraping the bottom to keep it from burning, or kneaded the next day's bread with hands still red from the cold. Children might shell beans or twist cord for the lantern wicks. Even washing clothes turned into a slow, near-heroic affair, hauling buckets of melted snow, scrubbing by hand until your knuckles burned, then draping garments near the stove where they steamed for hours before finally growing stiff and dry. And all of it repeated, day after day, in a cycle that felt like it had no beginning and no promised end. Fire, water, feed, mend, cook, haul, patch. The work left your body leaden with fatigue, your mind sometimes dull with monotony. Yet beneath the drudgery ran a quiet, persistent current of purpose. Each small task pushed back the wilderness by another few feet, kept the walls between your fragile human warmth and the merciless freeze. The chores weren't simply obligations, they were a running argument against surrender.
Proof, carved out hour by hour, that life inside these walls still claimed the right to stand. When darkness fell early again, as it always did, you sat by the stove with feet stretched close to its iron belly, shoulders relaxing by inches as the familiar tasks wound down. Outside, the cold prowled and tested the seams, but inside, your small, painstaking rituals had secured another day. And tomorrow? Well, tomorrow would demand the same all over again. But for tonight, the chores were done, the animals bedded, the fire fed. And that was enough to carry you across the thin bridge of sleep, ready to shoulder winter's weight once more come morning. When winter stretched on and the days all blurred into the same dim, sleep-colored monotony, a new kind of threat crept in, quieter than frostbite, but just as insidious. Settlers called it by many names, but most often simply cabin fever, a restlessness that wormed its way under your skin, a prickling sense of being trapped so tightly that even the walls seemed to lean in closer by the day. It wasn't a fever in the usual sense, but a subtle gnawing malaise that could make tempers flare, smiles fade, and even turn your own thoughts into unwelcome company. Life narrowed to such a small circle in the dead of winter. The same walls day after day, the same voices, the same ceaseless wind outside. You rose to tend the stove, to haul water, to feed livestock if the weather allowed, and then returned inside to wait for the next round. Snow sealed the world in silence, draping over doors and windows until it felt as if you'd been buried alive. Even sound was muffled, each laugh or sudden shout dying quickly against the thick walls and heavier air. To keep that creeping dullness from cracking into something darker, families, and lone homesteaders, if they were wise, turned to humble diversions. Books were treasures, carried west at great expense and risk. A single volume might be read so many times its binding came apart. Stories recited from memory until even the youngest child could quote entire passages. The Bible was common, but so were tattered novels, volumes of poetry, stray newspapers months out of date. Anything that offered fresh words, new pictures for the mind, was seized on gratefully. Hands found solace in busy work. Women, and often men too, took to mending clothes by lamplight, piecing together scraps into quilts whose bright patterns gave a welcome dash of color against the drab tones of winter. Children carved small toys from leftover wood or twisted scraps of cloth into dolls. Older folks might whittle quietly by the stove, shavings curling away like delicate ribbons. These weren't just pastimes, they were shields against the hours that stretched too long, a way to keep the mind as nimble as the fingers. Stories rose as naturally as breath in such confined spaces. After supper, with the night deepening outside and the wind scratching at the seams of the cabin, families gathered close by the stove. Someone might begin a tale of childhood pranks back east, of ghost lights seen on lonely trails, of old battles or strange creatures said to haunt nearby rivers. The telling would pass from mouth to mouth, each person adding a flourish or a remembered detail. Even somber tales of hardship from the crossing or earlier winters were revisited, not to darken the mood, but to remind everyone how far they'd already come, how much they'd already endured. Music offered another path out of the mental mire. A fiddle was a near-prized possession, its notes bright enough to lift spirits, even when the melodies turned minor and plaintive. Harmonicas were common too, their thin voices rising above the sigh of the wind. If no instruments were at hand, voices took up the work, singing hymns or folk tunes learned from parents long gone. In such moments, you could almost forget the thick walls of snow, the pressing isolation, as songs swelled to fill the cramped room and carried your heart someplace lighter. Games helped. Simple things that might wear thin under normal circumstances, but took on new value when options were few. Card decks with dog-eared corners, checkers sets where mismatched pieces stood in for lost originals, or word games invented on the spot to pass the hours. Even competitive chores, who could split the most kindling or stack wood neatest, could stave off the slow creep of cabin fever. At its heart, surviving the psychological grind of winter was about tending the mind's fire just as carefully as the stove's. Let it grow neglected, let despair blow through unchecked, and the chill could settle deep inside in ways no blanket could fix. So people read and recited, stitched and carved, sang and played, telling stories that circled long into the night. They stoked laughter, even when nerves frayed, offered small comforts when someone's eyes grew distant. And by these humble acts, shared tales, busy hands, a fiddle tune dancing over the drone of the wind, they kept at bay the strangest danger of all, the feeling that winter might last forever, that the cabin might shrink tighter until you could scarcely breathe. Each song, each scrap of fabric pieced into a quilt, each story retold, was a soft declaration that the human heart was still its own warm place, stubbornly lit against the cold season pressing so close on every side. As night pressed close around the little cabin, the day's chores finally gave way to something slower, softer, a gentle easing of the shoulders, a long breath out after hours of vigilant toil. Evenings on the frontier didn't offer entertainment in any polished sense, no grand diversions to erase memory of the cold waiting just beyond the walls. But they had their own tender rituals that wrapped families together almost as snugly as the blankets they'd later pull over their shoulders. The center of it all was the fire. Whether crackling in a modest hearth or contained behind the iron door of a stove, its glow was more than mere light and heat. It was a quiet promise that life continued here, inside this tiny fortress of log and mud, despite the vast, indifferent wilderness pressing close. As the flames licked higher, casting golden patterns on rough-hewn walls, you could almost believe you were safe, if only for a little while. Lamps were trimmed and lit, their weak flames magnified by smoky glass. The soft illuminations spilled out in tender circles, leaving the corners of the room to darkness. This gentle light felt almost sacred after the bleak gray of day, a fragile radiance that seemed to draw people inward. It made faces glow warmly, shadows dancing across cheeks and eyes in a way that turned simple closeness into something profound. In that mellow hush, voices lowered without anyone needing to ask, as though speaking too loudly might startle away the comfort the lamp and fire so carefully wove. Families fell into patterns honed by many long winters. Someone might darn socks or patch elbows worn shiny by months of work. A child would carefully stack carved wooden figures in towers destined to tumble with delighted squeals, laughter muffled quickly so as not to seem careless in a season that allowed so little waste. Others rocked slowly in creaky chairs, staring into the heart of the flames as if waiting for answers to questions they couldn't quite form. But the true balm of the evening lay in stories. They rose naturally, the way breath did in the cold, swirling through the room and wrapping around everyone present. A father might start with tales of his own boyhood back east, recounting mischievous tricks pulled on schoolmasters, or races run barefoot down dusty lanes long before life grew this serious. A mother would follow with a gentler yarn, perhaps half fairy tale, half family legend. Stories of ancestors crossing oceans, of farmsteads lit by lanterns that seemed to hold back entire worlds of dark. Older children joined in with ghost stories learned from neighbors or traveling peddlers, voices dipping low at just the right moments to send pleasant chills up spines. Even the smallest among them had their place in this nightly chorus. Wide-eyed little ones contributed half-finished dreams of talking animals and enchanted forests, tales that made no logical sense, but sparkled with the fearless magic only a child's mind could conjure. And all around them, the fire popped inside, as if it too were listening, lending its own murmurs to the tapestry of voices. Preparing for bed became its own kind of ritual. Before anyone could surrender fully to sleep, there were final rounds to make, checking that the stove was banked properly, that the kettle had enough water to humidify the air through the long hours to come. Windows were inspected to be sure coverings hadn't shifted, letting in sly drafts. Blankets were shaken out and layered carefully. No one ever laid down lightly in winter, knowing how quickly the night could steal into your bones if you gave it half a chance. Sometimes, before the lamp was finally snuffed, someone would murmur a prayer. It wasn't always a formal grace, not always words learned by rote from battered hymnals. Often it was just a soft appeal for protection through the hours of darkness, for the fire to hold strong, for loved ones near and far to wake in the morning with breath still warm and steady. In the hush that followed, hope itself felt like a tangible thing, a fragile ember cradled between all of them, needing each careful breath to keep it alive. Then darkness closed in, thicker and more absolute than any city dweller could imagine. The last glow from the stove still painted faint stripes across the floor, and out beyond the walls the winter wind prowled on, testing the seams. But for a time it was kept at bay. Inside lay the small circle of warmth and light and shared stories, a nightly miracle renewed by simple human hands. And when eyes finally closed, it was with the soft comfort of knowing that, for yet another evening, they had made it, together, through the cold and the dark.
Night on the frontier wasn't a single smooth stretch of sleep from dusk until dawn. Instead, it unfolded in a curious rhythm that now seems almost alien to our modern minds, but was then simply the natural pattern of life, shaped by dark, cold, and the needs of survival. People spoke of a first sleep and a second sleep, two distinct periods of rest separated by an hour or more of quiet wakefulness that carried its own strange sort of peace. The first sleep began soon after supper, once the evening stories wound down and the stove was carefully banked. Fatigue from the day's labors, hauling water, chopping wood, tending animals, wrapped around tired bodies like an extra quilt. Families would burrow under heavy layers, sometimes 2 or 3 in a bed, sharing warmth without shame. Within moments, the deep weariness of frontier life pulled them under. But unlike today's expectation of an unbroken 8 hours, people naturally woke after a few hours of profound slumber. Their eyes would open to a darkness still thick around them, the faint orange pulse of the stove's dying coals, the only glow in the room. This middle-of-the-night hour was no cause for alarm, it was simply how nights passed. They called it the watch, a calm interlude that was woven into the very fabric of winter life. During this time, each person found quiet ways to fill the stillness. Some prayed or reflected on the day, whispering soft hopes for the health of kin far off, or giving thanks that the roof still held and the stores had lasted this far. Others used the hour to rise and stir the embers, feeding them fresh wood so the cabin would not slip into dangerous cold before morning. The act of tending the fire was more than a chore. It was a reassurance that life continued, that flames still answered to human hands, even in the small hours when the world seemed most vulnerable. Parents would check on children, pulling blankets up around small shoulders, feeling for warmth in cheeks and hands. It wasn't just tenderness, it was necessary vigilance. In cabins where temperatures could plummet to near the freezing point if the fire failed, catching a child shivering too hard or slipping toward a dangerous chill was a matter of real consequence. A gentle rub of cold fingers, a quick rearrangement of bedding, and sleep might continue without harm. Others took the quiet to mend or read by lamplight. This was when a woman might add a few careful stitches to a tear discovered during the day, or a man sharpened his knife by the stove. Some simply lay awake, talking softly so as not to wake children. voices blending with the gentle clicks of cooling wood and the sighs of wind outside. Far from unsettling, these waking moments often brought a strange intimacy and calm, a pause in life's constant demands. When drowsiness crept back, they would slip into the second sleep, sometimes deeper and more restorative than the first. This final stretch carried them through the last dark hours to the wan light of dawn. Waking again felt almost like stepping into a new day, the earlier interlude a soft bridge that made the night seem less harsh. Modern doctors and historians would later argue that this biphasic sleep actually suited the body well, lowering stress and allowing warmth to be more closely guarded. Rising in the middle of the night to check on the fire, to move about, to ensure the blood kept flowing, helped prevent the deep chilling of limbs that so often led to frostbite or worse. It also strengthened the fragile barrier of heat around which each family's survival spun. A stove left untended too long could fade from red glow to dark iron, and restarting it from cold took precious time during which frost might creep in and seize on exposed skin. So this habit of sleeping in two halves, of waking gently and tending both hearth and heart before returning to dreams, wasn't a quirk of the past. It was a finely tuned adaptation, born of long seasons in which the night itself was an unpredictable companion. It kept people connected to their homes, their families, and their fragile lifelines of warmth, a living pulse inside each small cabin that echoed together across the snowy miles of the frontier. In the end, it was not merely how they survived the long dark, but how they found quiet moments of reflection and connection even in the coldest depths of winter. It never arrived all at once. Spring crept in shyly, sending tentative scouts long before it committed itself fully to banishing the cold. You'd stand outside on a morning that didn't slice quite so cruelly at your face and catch something in the air, a faint, wet smell, the soft hint of earth underneath the hard crust of snow. The sky changed first, trading its flat, unyielding gray for a fragile sort of blue that almost looked embarrassed to be seen after so many months hidden. Then there was the sound of water. It started as isolated drips, tiny notes that might have been easy to miss if your ears weren't so starved for anything besides wind. Soon, rivulets ran off the eaves, pattering down to carve little channels in the banks pressed against the cabin walls. Even the snow itself seemed to sigh, settling lower with an almost reluctant slump, as if admitting at last that winter couldn't hold on forever. People watched these signs with a complicated mix of hope and dread. A thaw meant relief from bitter cold, the promise that you might soon open the door without bracing yourself as though stepping into a fight. It meant no longer waking every hour at night to feed the stove, no longer cracking ice off water buckets just to keep animals from dying of thirst. You'd let your shoulders drop, thinking maybe, just maybe, you'd come through the worst. But spring's first visit was often a deceit, and frontier folk knew better than to trust it outright. More than one winter had played this trick. Soft days in March that coaxed a few birds back to the yard, melted the top layer of snow into sloppy slush, only for a cruel snap to return with sharpened claws. Those sudden plunges could be worse than the steady, deep cold of January, because by then, both people and animals were run down, their bodies half convinced it was safe to ease their guard. There was danger, too, in what the melt revealed. As drifts shrank, they gave up secrets they'd hidden for months, grim shapes caught in the ice that resolved into the stiff, bloated bodies of cattle that hadn't survived. Sometimes the snow retreated from fence lines, only to show posts leaned over or snapped by the weight of drifts that had pressed against them for weeks. Sheds and barns emerged with sagging roofs, some already buckled under loads they could no longer bear once the snow turned a heavy, sodden mass. You walked the yard cautiously, boots sinking through rotted patches of snow, the cold mud beneath. Each footstep made a squelch
that sounded almost obscene after the long hush of winter. Meltwater pooled in unexpected places, creeping under thresholds, soaking the lowest boards of cabins until they darkened with moisture. More than one family ended up fighting mold and mildew that sprang to eager life with the first touch of warmth. Even so, there was no denying the slow lifting of spirits that came with these early thaws. The sun climbed a little higher each day, its rays landing on faces upturned, not just to see, but to feel. Children who had spent months bundled tight ran outside, breathless and awkward in the unfamiliar freedom, squabbling with bright voices that startled birds from trees newly exposed by retreating snow.
Still, caution ruled over celebration. Frontier people had learned through hard lessons that spring was a season of false starts, that to rush too quickly into joy was to risk heartbreak. They kept fires burning low in stoves, laid extra blankets on beds, watched the sky for the sudden gathering of dark clouds that could mean yet another spiteful snowstorm. Hope lived side by side with worry, and each day of thaw was greeted with gratitude tempered by an old ingrained wariness. Because until the last ice had run into swollen creeks, until green shoots broke through earth that truly lost its chill, winter was never entirely gone. It lingered in the shadowy corners of the yard, in the wind that could still cut through a coat given half a chance, in the cautious eyes of neighbors scanning the horizon. Spring might be whispering that it was on its way, but the people of the frontier knew better than to turn their backs on winter until it was well and truly forced to retreat. So they moved carefully through those first mild days, equal parts relieved and afraid, listening to the drip of meltwater like a fragile promise not yet fully kept. When spring finally arrived in earnest, not with a single triumphant day, but in a slow, dogged advance that couldn't be chased back by an angry last storm, it felt less like the land waking up and more like a long, pained sigh of relief. Everywhere you looked, the world seemed awkwardly alive again. Snowdrifts melted into streaky patches, their edges jagged and dirty, giving way to bare earth that smelled sharp and raw. Streams swelled with meltwater, rushing over stones with a reckless urgency, as if trying to make up for months of silence. People greeted this new season with hearts tangled in both joy and unease. There was so much to be done, more than could possibly fit into the early weeks of sun and thaw. The moment the ground could hold a wagon without swallowing its wheels, families set to work with a kind of frantic purpose. Fences needed righting. Posts that had been pushed sideways by months of snow had to be dug up and replanted, rails nailed back where winter winds had battered them loose. Roofs were checked for leaks, mud daubed into fresh cracks in cabin walls. Barn doors were rehung, hinges oiled, everything prodded and mended to stand a chance against next year's tests. Then came the cleaning. Months spent indoors left cabins stale and dim, the air thick with smoke from countless fires, the corners layered in grime that no amount of midwinter sweeping could fully conquer. Now windows were pried open, if only for minutes at a time, letting cool, damp breezes chase away the heavy scent of tallow, damp wool, and human closeness. Bedding was hauled outside and beaten with sticks to drive out dust and whatever unseen things had taken shelter there. Rugs and garments were aired across fences, fluttering like bright signals against a still mostly brown world.
People also counted their losses, quite literally. Herds were rounded up, cattle and horses driven out of cramped winter pens to see how they fared on unsteady legs. Many walks ended with grim discoveries in thickets or low spots, where animals that had wandered off during storms or simply laid down too weak to rise again left only hollow-eyed carcasses. It was a bitter arithmetic, tallying the living against the memory of what should have been there, each missing cow or horse a wound that would echo through the family's fortunes for seasons to come. Yet for all the hard work and quiet sorrow, spring also brought back something desperately missed: people. Over winter, neighbors might live a mere few miles apart, yet feel as distant as another country, cut off by drifts and howling winds that made travel dangerous or simply impossible. Now, as the trails turned from frozen lanes to muddy ruts, wagons began appearing again. Someone's approach was often heralded by barking dogs, excited children running to the door. Visitors brought small gifts, a jar of preserved berries, news of births or weddings planned, sometimes just their laughter and long stories that curled through the cabin like fresh air. Social gatherings resumed in earnest. If a barn still stood solid enough, it might host a dance, fiddles scraping lively tunes that pulled stiff, winter-sore bodies into motion again. Neighbors swapped news of which fields had thawed first, who planned to plant extra acres of corn, whose son was courting whose daughter. Even small shared tasks like helping mend a neighbor's roof or driving loose stock back from a common pasture became excuses to gather, to remember the warmth of human company after so long fenced in by ice. And underlying it all was that fragile, necessary hope that the seeds planted soon would take root, that calves born weak would strengthen on new grass, that barns patched in haste would stand another year. The land itself seemed to hum with cautious optimism. Birds returned to chatter noisily in trees still bare of leaves, while the first shy wildflowers peeked through the battered ground. In these first real weeks of spring, people balanced on a knife edge between anxiety and anticipation. They worked themselves to exhaustion, yet managed to smile more easily, feeling the sun on their faces like a gentle benediction. It wasn't that they forgot how cruel the past months had been. It was simply that life pushed forward, demanding attention, urging hands and hearts alike to reach out of winter's long shadow and build something worth protecting all over again.
By the time the last heaps of snow finally melted into muddy ruts and the land lay open once more, it was clear to nearly everyone that nothing would ever be quite the same. The brutal winters, and none more so than that infamous season of 1886-1887, had carved a deep, permanent scar into the very heart of life on the frontier. The West emerged from that cold grip changed, not just in detail, but in its entire rhythm, its dreams, even its quiet assumptions of what life here was meant to be. Gone was much of the old romantic notion of the wide open range. For decades, cattlemen had let immense herds wander freely across unfenced prairies, following instinct and the promise of fresh grass. The land seemed endless, and the sun-browned cowboys who rode after these herds were almost mythic figures, basking in a rough freedom that answered to neither clock nor wall. It was a vision of abundance that felt as permanent as the sky, until winter proved otherwise. That catastrophic season showed just how fragile this supposed plenty truly was. Snow piled up in drifts taller than a horse's shoulder, ice sealed away the grass beneath a cruel crust, and cattle by the tens of thousands starved where they stood or froze against each other in tragic, unmoving knots. By spring, the losses were staggering, and the devastation wasn't limited to animals alone. Fortunes vanished. Ranches that had seemed near to dynasties buckled under debts they could no longer pay. Families packed up in silence, leaving behind empty homesteads and pastures haunted by sun-bleached bones. In the bitter lessons that followed, the West reinvented itself. Barbed wire, once met with suspicion or outright hostility by many who treasured the free range, was rolled out in mile after mile of prickling lines. It parceled the land into tidy claims, corralling livestock so they could be better monitored, easier to protect from wandering too far in harsh weather. Where once the horizon stretched uninterrupted, now it was stitched over with fences, each strand a silent acknowledgement that nature's generosity couldn't be relied on without some human intervention. With fences came a new way of thinking about feed. No longer could ranchers count on prairie grasses to sustain cattle through any winter. Barns were expanded, hay lofts built larger, and long summers now meant days spent not just watching herds, but cutting, curing, and stacking hay in cautious, deliberate preparation. Grain silos rose like sentinels over homesteads. The old reckless bravado of letting thousands roam untended gave way to ledgers, planning, a careful eye on coming weather that spoke not of fear, but hard-earned respect. Economically, the frontier shifted too. Small operations that couldn't adapt faded, while those with enough capital to invest in feed, fencing, and sturdier shelters carved out a steadier, if less glamorous, future. Banks began to favor more conservative loans, demanding clear signs that a rancher could survive another merciless season. Towns grew more fixed and deliberate, their businesses catering less to wild cattle drives and more to the steady hum of contained, managed agriculture. Even the culture changed. The cowboy himself, once the symbol of unchained liberty, galloping across seas of grass, remained, but his work grew more bound to gate latches and feeding troughs, more about maintenance than adventure. Communities tightened. Neighbors now relied on each other for shared threshing machines, for help stacking hay before sudden rains. The mythic loneliness of the West mellowed slightly into something more cooperative, born of mutual experience with nature's power. And still, woven through all these new habits and fences and winter stockpiles, ran an undercurrent of humility. The land hadn't been tamed so much as temporarily negotiated with. Those who stayed learned to bow their heads when frost threatened, to watch the skies with wary eyes, to treat every bale of hay and stacked cord of wood like a promise against future hardship. So that terrible winter left more than empty pastures and bankrupted dreams in its wake. It reshaped the very bones of frontier life, driving home an unspoken truth. Out here, survival belonged not to the boldest or the loudest, but to those willing to change, to mend fences and relationships both, to measure carefully, to plan with an eye always on the horizon where another storm might already be building. In that way, the cold that once seemed only to destroy had, in its pitiless fashion, forged a new West, harder, wiser, and perhaps, for all its losses, finally strong enough to last. Long after the last pioneer cabins fell into ruin and the trails of cattle drives were swallowed by plow and pasture, the stories of those bitter frontier winters continued to echo. They weren't just dusty tales told for idle wonder. They carried hard-won truths that still press quietly against the shape of our lives. Even now, surrounded by comforts and technologies those settlers could scarcely have imagined. What did those long months of biting cold and endless chores teach that still matters today? At the simplest level, they revealed how fragile the line truly is between comfort and calamity. It took only a shift in the wind, a stretch of storm that lingered a week too long, to turn abundance into desperation. Food that seemed ample in September proved woefully short by February. A homestead that stood stout under sunny skies groaned and cracked when draped with tons of ice and snow. People learned, sometimes with brutal swiftness,
that nature played by its own rules and offered no special mercy for optimism or oversight. And so they planned, conserved, respected. Those habits of stocking up, of preparing for the day when the sun might vanish behind steel-colored clouds, weren't born from needless fear, but from a clear-eyed acceptance of reality. Today, with thermostats and supermarkets at arm's reach, it's easy to forget the delicate machinery that keeps modern life humming. But the lessons of the frontier winters whisper otherwise. Have a plan. Keep your stores full. Maintain the tools that keep you warm and fed. Not because disaster is certain, but because uncertainty always is. Beyond the physical preparations, there was a deeper resilience, a psychology of survival honed by months in cramped cabins with winds moaning around every seam. These people understood how quickly loneliness and fear could hollow you out. They invented small rituals, not simply to pass the time, but to safeguard their minds, telling stories by lamplight, gathering close around the stove to share laughter that cut through the dark. They sang, read from tethered books, played humble games. Even the simple acts of sewing or whittling gave restless hands purpose, grounding thoughts that might otherwise spiral into despair. It's easy to dismiss these old domestic pastimes as quaint, but there was profound wisdom in them. They turned waiting into creation, boredom into connection. In a world where a single spark from the stove might spell ruin, they learned the art of watchfulness, not anxious panic, but calm, attentive care. Fires were tended, doors secured, neighbors quietly checked on after storms. Each small act, a stitch in the fabric that held communities together.
Perhaps most enduring was the respect, even awe, they carried for the natural world. Winter on the frontier didn't just test bodies, it humbled hearts. No amount of grit or stubbornness could command the seasons to change. Those who endured longest did so by working with the rhythms of the land rather than railing against them. They harvested when the sun was generous, built thick walls and cellars in anticipation of scarcity, honored the vast cycles of weather and life that dwarfed human ambition. That humility is a lesson still sorely needed. In our age of climate control and instant information, there's a temptation to see ourselves as somehow beyond the reach of nature's old power. But floods still rise, winds still tear down the works of our hands, and cold snaps still remind us how thin the veneer of safety can be. The stories of frontier winters caution against arrogance. They offer instead a philosophy built on preparation, mutual reliance, and a profound respect for forces that remain forever larger than us. So when we remember those dim cabins lit by stoves and lanterns, when we hear of families drawing together through nights that howled outside their walls, we're not just hearing history, we're glimpsing a blueprint for facing uncertainty with steadiness and grace. It's there in the careful storing of food, in the hands busy with humble crafts, in the voices raised together in song against the cold. It's in the quiet understanding that strength isn't about conquering the world, but learning how to live within it, alert and compassionate, ready to weather what comes, together. In that way, the legacy of those winters is more than just tales of hardship. It's a testament to human adaptability and the deep, enduring power of community and respect. Lessons as vital today, under our electric lights and humming heaters, as they ever were under the low, flickering glow of a frontier lamp.